All right, welcome to chapter 48, the immune system in animals. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to explain how the innate immune responses defend against broad groups of pathogens, how the adaptive immune response recognizes pathogen-specific antigens, compare and contrast the steps required for activating B cells and T cells, compare and contrast how the adaptive immune system responds to extracellular versus intracellular pathogens, and use examples to discuss the problems that can arise when human immune systems function improperly. All right, so what is immunity? Immunity is a resistance to or protection against a disease-causing pathogen. So the immune system of an animal is responsible for defending the animals against pathogens. Okay, a pathogen is basically anything that infects, okay? It could be a virus, it could be bacteria, it could be a protist, whatever. Okay, so the immune system depends on three basic processes for success. The first one is preventing potential pathogens from getting in the first place. The second one is detecting the presence of the pathogens and being able to tell what's a pathogen and what's your own body. And then the third part is to eliminate the pathogen. So we're going to start by talking about innate immunity, and all animals have innate immunity, every single one. Okay, so the innate immune system is our first line of defense, and this includes basically things like our skin, or if you're an insect, your cuticle, which is a physical barrier that prevents pathogens from getting in. Mucus, so a lot of animals have mucus, well actually most animals, or if not all of them, which is a slimy mix of glycoproteins and water, and the goal of mucus is to trap pathogens and then slough off the pathogens. So like the mucus in your nose, right, is basically trapping pathogens, and that mucus will either be transported to your stomach where those will be digested, or I guess you could blow your nose and get it out of your nose, either or. We also, even though we don't like to think about it too much, have an oily secretion that our skin makes. And this creates a dry acidic environment, and most pathogens do not grow very well on the kind of oils that we secrete on the outside of our bodies. We also have waxy secretions in our ears, which do something similar, because obviously your ears are a hole in your head. And we have substances that occur in our tears called lysozymes, which are antibiotic and kill many kinds of bacteria. We have a type of a cell, the white cell or a leukocyte, that provides an immediate generic response against broad groups of pathogens. So this is a kind of pictorial description of the inflammatory response, which is part of the innate immune system. And it is what happens at the actual site where an injury occurs. So here is like the skin, right? Here's basically you've been cut here. Here's the outside of your body, and then here's your vessels on the inside of your body. Okay, so you have a cut, and so bacteria and the other pathogens that are kind of lingering on the outside of your skin but can't get in will then enter the wound. So then platelets from the blood will release blood clotting proteins at the site of the wound. All right, so these are the blood clotting proteins, and so our red blood cells are producing, so the platelet is producing these proteins, the platelets are the little yellow ones, and then the proteins that they're secreting are drawn as these little strings, okay? All right, the tissue that gets injured, and also macrophage cells, these big globby ones that were at the site that got injured, will start releasing a chemical called a chemokine, and the chemokine sends a message which recruits immune cells to that area. Okay, so the chemokines are being sent out, and they're traveling around, and that is attracting other cells, okay? So mast cells at the site will secrete histamine and other factors that dilate the blood vessels nearby. So here the blood vessels have become larger, okay? And it makes them more permeable so that you can do things like transport the larger cells that you need out of the blood vessels to the place where the injury occurred. So neutrophils are recruited to remove the pathogens by phagocytosis, so they're basically eating the pathogens, so they're coming up to do that, and so they were able to come in because the blood vessel, the histamine made the blood vessel leaky so that these cells could get into the place where the wound is occurring. And then you have other recruited leukocytes that will mature into macrophages and then phagocytize the pathogens and also secrete key signaling molecules to bring over other helpers. Okay? All right, so that's the inflammatory response. All right, so inflammatory responses typically include, which ones of these? Clotting proteins migrating away from the site of infection?
No, that's the wrong direction.
Yeah, they should be going towards it, right? Increased activity of phagocytes in an inflamed area?
That sounds okay.
Reduced permeability of blood vessels to conserve plasma? No, that's not it. They're becoming more permeable. Okay, release of substances to decrease the blood supply to the inflamed area?
No, you want to have more blood supply.
Inhibiting the release of white blood cells from bone marrow?
No, that's the opposite.
All right, so which one is it?
B.
Yep. All right, so we talked about the innate immune response. Now we're going to talk about the adaptive immune response. So this is a system that's based on interactions between specific immune system cells and a specific antigen. So an antigen is any molecule capable of inducing an immune response. Usually we like to think of antigens as kind of the little nubbins on the outside of the virus or the bacteria, okay? The adaptive immune system uses antibodies. So these are these secreted proteins that bind to a specific part of a specific antigen. So this is what antibodies can look different ways, but this is one main way that an antibody can look. So kind of a Y-shaped molecule. And at the tips of the arms, it has like little nooks and crannies that fit the particular antigens that are on the outside. So imagine this antigen is attached to the outside of a virus. So in this antibody, the little cranny fits the little nubbin on the antigen, then the antibody knows that the antigen is there. All right, so antigens have the ability to respond to a seemingly limitless array of antigens. Antibodies have the ability to change the little nooks and crannies on the binding site very rapidly. All right, so we talked about all animals had innate immunity. Only 1% of animals have adaptive immunity, so it's less common in animals. There are 4 major characteristics of an adaptive immune response. First, specificity. So the antibodies, remember those Y-shaped molecules, and the other components of the adaptive immune system will only bind to the very specific sites on specific antigens, okay? So they match very, very particularly. Diversity. So the adaptive immune response can recognize almost any type of antigen. So no matter what kind of a nubbin is on the outside of your virus or bacteria, you can make an antibody to match it. Memory. So adaptive immune responses are stronger and quicker when you've been exposed to an antigen before. So the second time you encounter an antigen you've been exposed to before, your immune response is going to be faster and stronger. And then the fourth component is non-self recognition. So the molecules that are produced by an individual don't usually trigger an immune response, right? We're not supposed to respond to our own cells, only to invading cells. So the adaptive immune system has to be able to distinguish between self and non-self. Okay, so lymphocytes are a major kind of cell that's involved in the adaptive immune response. And their job is to recognize antigens. Antigens, again, those are the little nubbins on the outside of the viruses and the bacteria. So they recognize antigens that become activated and then circulate throughout the blood and the secondary organs of the immune system. So B cells and T cells are both lymphocytes. Okay, the B and the T is because B cells are made in the bone marrow and T cells are made in the thymus. Okay. So B cells will produce antibodies, right? Those little Y-shaped molecules that stick to antigens. T cells mature in the thymus, and the job of the T cell is to recognize and kill host cells that are infected. So if you have a host cell that has been infected with a virus, the T cell will come over and kill the host cell before the virus can spread to other nearby cells. All right, so this is kind of how this works. So I'm just showing a little antigen here. It looks like a little pebble, but maybe that pebble is attached to the outside of a virus or something, but whatever it is. The antigen will get over here and it'll stick to this antibody, okay? This particular antibody is an antibody stuck to a B cell, okay? So when you got an antibody stuck to a B cell, like this is called a B cell receptor, because the antibody acts like a receptor to be able to tell the B cell that it has found an antigen, okay? So the B cell recognizes the invader, So the B cell will encounter and bind to this antigen. Okay, the next thing that happens is this little antigen is internalized, so it's actually taken inside the cell and processed, and then the peptide fragments of the antigen will appear on the other side of the B cell. It'll be presented with this little kind of peptide complex. So this B cell is basically showing the antigen saying, hey, look what I found. Okay? So the B cell is showing the antigen, hey, look what I found, to this helper T cell. Okay? So here's the T cell. T cell has antibodies on the outside. Antibodies on the T cell are straight. They're not Y-shaped, but don't worry about that. Okay. So the little antibodies on the outside of the T cell are like, hey, look what you found, right? And so that stimulates the T cell. And then the T cell, in turn, stimulates the B cell to activate, okay? And the way that the T cell helps the B cell activate is through these cytokine signaling molecules. Okay, so the cytokines are sent from the T cell to the B cell. Now the B cell is activated. All right, so just to review, the B cell binds to the antigen and shows it to the T cell. The T cell gets the message and then activates the B cell. All right, now the B cell is activated. So what does the B cell do when it's activated? It will replicate, and some of the daughter cells are going to differentiate into plasma cells, and the plasma cells will make lots and lots of these antibodies. So the antibodies, these antibodies are not attached to the B cells. Instead, the antibodies, or the plasma cells, these antibodies are loose. And so those antibodies just stick to the outside of the antigens and mark them for destruction. So if you find like a virus particle inside the host, it'll be all covered in these antibodies, and that'll help the body know that that particle needs to get destroyed. So the adaptive immune response has two mechanisms. The cell-mediated response is a response that happens with cell-to-cell contact. And so this involves activation of the phagocytic cells and cytotoxic T lymphocytes. So remember we talked about that you get these little proteins that, so here we have a cytotoxic T cell over here that recognizes and binds to an infected cell. So this is a virus infected cell over here. And so the T cell is able to detect the infection over here and bind to it. And so if you look up close here, we can see that that they are kind of communicating. Here's the T cell on the top, and here is the virus infected cell on the bottom. And so a message and also chemicals that induce apoptosis are being sent. Do you remember what apoptosis is? Yeah, that's programmed cell death. Yeah. So those are being sent into the infected cell that are basically telling it to undergo apoptosis and die. Okay? So the cell is basically dead. It forms these little, they're called blebs.
What?
They're called blebs.
What?
Blebs.
That's not a word.
No, I'm not making it up. They're literally called blebs. All right. So now the infected cell is dead, and it's been inactivated, so a macrophage can come by and eat it. Okay? So it's cell-mediated because it's just a direct communication between the cytotoxic T cell and this infected cell. All right, the humoral response involves producing antibodies and other proteins that are secreted into the blood or the lymph. And so you have, here's your pathogen, is this orange guy over here, and here's your antibodies. And so you have a couple different things that can happen here. Your pathogen will be covered in the antibodies over here, and so it can get eaten. The antibodies on the outside can prevent it can prevent the pathogen from actually getting into a host, so it's neutralized. It can just the antibodies can glob all over the outside of the pathogen or agglutinate it so that it can't really do anything. Or the presence of the antibodies can cause these complement proteins to come in and help to break down the pathogen. So those are all different ways that sending antibodies out into the bloodstream can cause the pathogen to die. All right, so does cellular or humoral immunity require cell-to-cell contact?
Okay, come on, it's in the name.
Okay, well tell me.
Cellular.
All right. Does cellular or humoral immunity produce antibodies? Humoral immunity. All right, is cellular immunity adaptive or innate?
It's adaptive.
Is humoral immunity adaptive or innate?
Oh, it's adaptive also.
Yeah, both of those are adaptive. All right, so once you have activated B cells and T cells, they'll produce these specialized daughter cells called memory cells, right? So they'll divide and divide and divide, and a lot of the cells will go to help fight the pathogen, but then some of the cells will get set aside for later. And so these memory cells that are set aside for later can remain in the spleen and the lymph for years or decades. So if you are ever exposed to the same pathogen again, your body already has produced a very specific kind of a cell that can recognize that pathogen. And so you can see in this picture here, so this is the first time you're exposed to the antigen, and you have an immune response here, and it takes a while to go away. If you're exposed later, you will have a very rapid and strong response, and that will drop off quickly. And so what is happening here is the second time you're exposed to that pathogen, you may not even know that you're sick. Your body may respond with such a strong immune response that you don't get any symptoms and you feel totally fine. When you take a vaccine contains antigens from a pathogen or a killed or weakened version of the pathogen itself. So some vaccines have just the little nubbins on the outside of the pathogen, right? So it's, just the nubbins. Some have the pathogen itself. Maybe it's been killed or weakened, so it can't hurt you. And then after vaccination, the body is going to mount a primary immune response that produces memory cells, and so that later, when you actually encounter the disease in the real world, the memory cells respond and eliminate the threat before you become sick. All right, so vaccinations require that humans have which kind of an immune system?
Oh, I guess you have to have an adaptive immune system so you can make them memory cells, right?
Yeah. Do you have to have an innate immune system?
I mean, I guess not.
Right. Okay. The immune system can sometimes cause problems for some people. I mean, we need it or we would die, but sometimes things can go wrong with the immune system. So if you have an allergy or an allergic reaction, that's when you would have an abnormally overreactive reaction to an antigen. And so a molecule that triggers this response is called an allergen. So you may be reacting to something that isn't actually harmful to your body. So, if you're allergic to pollen, the pollen isn't attacking your body, right? So that is a immune response to something that's an overreaction. You can also have an immune response triggered against your own healthy molecules, and this is known as autoimmunity. So this happens when you're having problems identifying self versus non-self. So diseases like multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis are both based on autoimmunity or a failure of cells to identify your own healthy molecules or cells. And then finally, an immunodeficiency disease is a disease that impairs the adaptive immune response. So some examples of this would be the disease SCID, severe combined immunodeficiency disease, which some children are born with. And these kids lack a normal immune system and can't fight off infections. And so if you've seen little kind of, movies or television stories about the boy in the bubble or little girl in a bubble, this is what it is. So kids who have no immune system can't fight off infections, and so they're kept in an environment without any pathogens. People who are infected with the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, will suffer from progressive failure of the immune system. So that is kind of a virus that basically causes the immune system to fail. All right, so hopefully you have learned a little bit about innate and adaptive immunity. You'll learn what happens if the immune system doesn't work correctly, and then we kind of did a little bit of a closer look at how B cells and T cells are used, and activation, memory, and response.